What I mean by perspective is, how big is God compared to you? Get some perspective. See, the first human couple, a man and a man, they decided at some point that they could be equal to God. They lost all sense of perspective. There were reasons why. They felt themselves to be a beautiful created being, of which God feels you are, of course, because he made you, and of course he thinks that he made you beautiful. But they then began to believe that they didn't need God to know or understand the universe, and that they could be gods themselves. And the biggest emotional injury that we have on this planet is our own feeling that we are our own lawmaker. That we have the right to govern ourselves. That's the biggest emotional injury that we have. So let's go. It's a good question, and to Alex on this side.
So my question is, the first women couple, they made a mistake.
Yes.
And
which probably we would have made if we were in the same circumstance.
Okay.
Yep.
My question is, why didn't they realize and went back to God? Because if I make a mistake, after that I realize I made a mistake.
Yep.
And probably I have more errors than they had.
The problem with making a mistake, and this is something you're going to find in your own life, the problem with making a mistake is that now a new condition in your soul exists because of the mistake. And that new condition then encourages you to make more mistakes. And what happens generally is a person doesn't see the trajectory of their mistakes until a long time down the future, when they can measure the results of those mistakes. So a man and a man make a mistake. So let's say they're here and they make a mistake. That puts them in this trajectory. It puts them in a direction towards making more mistakes. So they make another mistake and another mistake. But at this stage, they're not self-aware enough to measure the results of their own mistakes. It's only when the mistakes become more and more painful that the results start to get measured.
But then often...
But by the time the results are being measured, there's so many mistakes that have been made that the average person doesn't want to unmake them. They just want to continue trying something different. And if you think about your own life, this happens to many of you in your own life. You make a mistake and you go, oh, this isn't working out so well, I'll just do another thing. Without a lot of contemplation or thought necessarily, and you do the next thing. And sometimes it's a knee-jerk reaction to the previous thing you did, but it's just as much sin as the previous thing. So an example of that is like, let's say I'm a woman and I have a relationship with a man and he's very dominating, he's very controlling. So that was a mistake. So what do? I say, I don't want to be with a dominating man anymore. What do I want to have instead? I want to dominate the man. So I go and now find a man who I can dominate, which is another mistake. And see, I haven't measured the full reasons or consequences or causes even as to why I made the previous mistake. And so that then causes me to make a further mistake and a further mistake. And this is the trouble with sin, is once you start on its road, frequently it just causes you to sin more. And very few people have the internal set of awareness or moral character where they'll stop that process. Now, a man and a man weren't, most of you might think that they were built with a moral compass, but actually they were in the same state as you were when you were a baby, and there was no moral compass yet. It had to be developed. But in the process of making choices and decisions, their moral compass slowly got distorted, right? And so by the time they became aware of the problems they had created, there was also no longer a desire to fix it with God. They wanted to fix it themselves. They wanted to correct it themselves.
And could we also add to that? Very often as humans, we're very bad at measuring how we got, what was the
How we
mistake.
got there.
We often say, oh, it wasn't the true, we don't put the effects with the actual cause. We make a series of mistakes and then we blame something else for the effects, you know. Yep. We don't see, oh, it was that decision back there. We blame others, or we blame this other thing that we did, and we're very bad at putting causes with effects when we're sinning.
Yeah. So I've talked to our modern man, and their answer to that question, which is the exact question I asked them, was that they had gone on for many hundreds of years before they actually realised how big a mistake they made. And the result of that, of course, was that now they didn't know either how to undo the mistakes either. They didn't have... They had blocked off the potentiality of a relationship with God themselves, and in the process of doing that, there was no... They had to work it all out how to undo their own mistakes now. Now, as you well know, for many of you, you know, having no help to deal with your mistakes is tough, isn't it? Like you don't know whether you should do this thing or that thing, or should you make, what decision should you make? And that's the exact same feeling they had. Like, how do I now undo these mistakes? You know, they could see, by that stage, they could see that their relationship with God had been broken, but also they didn't know how to fix it, and they didn't know what to do to fix it. So they just continued in their way until they passed. And then, of course, eventually they made their way to the sixth year of the spirit world, which is where they were when I first met them. And then, obviously, they heard about God's truth, and then they progressed from that point onwards. But the key for many of us is to realise that if we were in the same circumstance, we possibly would have done the same things, you know. And if we're honest with ourselves, many of us like to be or like to believe we're our own God, our own lawmaker, and as a result of that, we have that same feeling that they had. I want to make my own laws. I want to ignore the potentiality of there being a God who made laws that would govern my life. But let's just go to Alex for a moment, because you had...
Hi. Since we're talking about size and perspective,
yeah,
isn't it that the more love, the bigger the things are? And was it in times of Ammon and the man that everything was bigger, themselves and the trees and everything?
It is true that their souls and their physical form was obviously better than ours are today. And also their souls were in a more pristine state, and they were the only beings that were, you know, the only humans that weren't born, right? So they were given a fully formed body, and so their birth, if you like, was like an unincarnated soul, like a child, put into a fully formed body. So they're the only people who've ever had that experience on this earth. A child being put into a fully formed body. But emotionally and intellectually and mentally and spiritually and sexually, they were undeveloped. They had to learn how to develop those things. So even though they had a perfect body that was created for them, and even though the earth by this stage had been well prepared for their arrival, so there was food everywhere, animals everywhere, creatures everywhere. In the place where they arrived, which was near where the Middle East is today, instead of it being like it is today, which is almost like a barren desert, it was a rainforest. It was beautiful. And we're talking 150,000 years or more ago on this earth. So there's been a lot of things happen to the earth since then. And in that place, so they arrived in this beautiful place, they arrived in a beautiful condition, but with no experience. And that's the thing you've got to bear in mind. There's no experience. There's no experience. They had to gather experience. And so they were like babies in an adult body. They had to learn how to that they could eat. They had to learn they could drink. They had to learn everything, just like you would if you were a baby having to learn everything. But they had an adult body to do that in. Does that make sense to you? Now, they're the only people on earth who've ever experienced that. So talking to them is very interesting because you find out a lot of things about their experience and what their experience is like. But what I'm trying to do is hone you back into this thing of that there is laws and perspective. And why did I raise Amon and Aman? Well, because Amon and Aman were placed into this universe when they were unconsciously created. In other words, there was a time before they incarnated on earth, they were unconscious of themselves. They didn't know themselves. They had no experience. They weren't self-aware. And then as soon as they were placed on the earth, they became self-aware. And their self-awareness gradually grew as time went on. And of course, they then made choices and decisions. But in the process, they lost perspective. They lost perspective because they started to believe that they could be their own God. So they lost perspective. The perspective being that the Creator created this universe and the Creator created the laws that govern it, and therefore the Creator was much, much larger than anything you could even imagine because he's larger than the universe itself. He has the power to control the universe itself. That's how much power God has. Now, when you're in this throes of development as a child, you don't understand these things. And you don't even, and many people on earth, even as adults who are 70, 80 years old, don't understand those things. They still feel that their power is the biggest power on earth. Many of us humans believe we are the biggest power on earth. You know, often from an evolutionary point of view, it's called we're the dominant predator, the apex predator. Yeah, but God doesn't enter that equation, does it? And not that God's an apex predator, but God is far greater than anything as human we could ever imagine. And far greater, and all of God's qualities I've learned are infinite in their nature. And that's something even as a human, on the entire time that I've progressed, I still struggle to understand, even though I've received a lot of God's love, still struggle to understand what that really means about God. Like, how is God this infinite creature? It's such an amazing concept. I know it to be true because that's been my experience of him. Right? But even though I know it to be true, my mind struggles with the idea of it. Right? And this is why your mind's no good. We talked about that last week in Brussels, how useless your mind is. Your mind was created by God for a purpose, to help you out, but not to become the dominant creature of your life, the dominant governing force of your life. Your mind has severe limitations, and this is something that I learnt in the first century, and I know to be a fact. Now, most people on earth don't believe that. Most people on earth believe the mind is the thing to develop. The mind is the thing to grow. The mind is the thing that causes you to make decisions. But it's not actually true, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But let's get back to this, because I want to just develop the theme a bit of the perspective.